The accounts that come down to us of the flight of the crew up the hillside nearly all conclude at this point, creating with detail only the happenings of those who survived, if only for a day, as Hellman did, or like Dietert at least reached the reef. Counting these two, only 5 are usually present in the story that goes on up the ridge. Only a sentence or two is given to those who, when last seen by Dodge, were all going in one direction, and when seen finally by Salih, were angling through openings in the smoke below him as he looked down from the top of the ridge. Although they are missing persons in this story, they are also its tragic victims. There is a simple aspect of this historiography, of course, to explain why. After last seen by the living, they pass silently out of the story and their own tragedy until their tragedy is over and they are found as bodies. No one who lives saw their sufferings. The historian, for a variety of reasons, can limit his account to first-hand witnesses, although a shortage of first-hand witnesses probably does not explain completely why contemporary accounts of the Man Gulch fire avert their eyes from the tragedy. If a storyteller thinks enough of storytelling to regard it as a calling, unlike a historian, he cannot turn from the sufferings of his characters. A storyteller, unlike a historian, must follow compassion wherever it leads him. He must be able to accompany his characters even into smoke and fire and bear witness to what they thought and felt even when they themselves no longer knew. This story of the Man Gulch fire will not end until it feels able to walk the final distance to the crosses with those who for the time being are blotted out by smoke. They were young and did not leave much behind them and need someone to remember them. The foreman, Dodge, also must be remembered as well as his crew, and it is again the storyteller's special obligation to see that he is. History will determine the direction or directions in which the storyteller must look for his enduring memories, and history says Dodge must live or die in his escape fire. Ordinary history says he lived by lying in the ashes of his escape fire until the main fire swept over him and cooled enough to let him stand up and brush himself off. The controversial history that was soon to follow, and has lasted ever since, charges that Dodge's escape fire set in front of the main fire was the fire that actually burned some of the crew and cut off others from escaping. Historical questions the storyteller must face, although in a place of his own choosing, but his most immediate question as he faces new material is always, will anything strange or wonderful happen here? The rights and wrongs come later, and likewise the scientific know-how. The most strange and wonderful thing on the hillside as the escape fire swept up it, shutting it out of sight in smoke and heat, is that a spot of it remained cool. The one cool spot was inside Dodge. It was the characteristic in him that Rumsey had referred to when Dodge returned from the head of the fire with Harrison and muttered something about a death trap. It was the characteristic he was best known by, the part of him that always kept cool and aloof and believed on principle and thinking to itself and keeping its thoughts to itself, because thinking out loud only got him into trouble. It was this characteristic in him that had started him to lead the crew down gulch to safety, then didn't like what it saw ahead and turned the crew back up gulch, trying to outrun the fire without his ever explaining his thoughts to the crew. His running, but not his thinking, stopped when he saw the top of the ridge, for he immediately thought his crew could not make the top, and so he immediately set his escape fire. When he tried to explain it, it was too late. No one understood him, except for himself. They passed it by. Except to him whom it saved, his escape fire has only one kind of value: the value of a thought of a fire foreman in time of emergency, judged purely as thought. The immediate answer to the storyteller's question about the escape fire is yes, it was strange and wonderful that, in this moment of time, when only a moment was left, Dodge's head worked. To see how Dodge's life as a woodsman shaped his thoughts in an emergency, and to follow his thoughts closely, one more tick must be added to the talk of his makeup. In an emergency, he thought with his hands. He had an unusual mechanical skill that helped him think. That at least structured his thoughts. It was a woodsman's mechanical skill. He liked to work with rifles, fix equipment, build lean-tos or log cabins. He wasn't fancy, he was handy. And in fact, that spring, he had been excused from training with the smoke jumper so that he could be maintenance man for the whole smoke jumper base. No doubt part of the cause of the tragedy he was about to face with a crew only 3 of whom he knew. The foreman then was facing this tragic emergency alone, withdrawn as he often was into his own thoughts, which were the thoughts men and women have who are wired together in such a way that their brains can't start moving without their hands moving at the same time. The present question then, in its purest form, is how many brains, how much guts did it take in those fiery seconds to conceive of starting another fire and lying down in it? In its maximum form, the question would be, did Dodge actually make an invention when 250 or 300 feet of solid flames were about to catch up to him? 2 of the Forest Service's great fire experts, W.R. Bud Moore and Edward Hellman, Moore's successor as Director of Fire Control and Aviation Management for the Forest Service's Region 1, have told me they never heard of this kind of escape fire before Dodge's use of it, and their experience corresponds to my own, which, though limited to summers when I was young, going back to 1918, Rumsey and Saleh say under oath that in 1949, nothing like it had been mentioned in their training course. And as Rumsey adds, even if it had been explained to them, he had seen it work, it seemed crazy enough so that he wasn't sure he would have stepped into it if it had been for real. A lot of questions about the woods can't be answered by staying all the time in the woods, and it also works the other way. A lot of deep inner questions get no answer unless you go for a walk in the woods. My colleague at the University of Chicago, Robert Ferguson, pointed out to me that James Fenimore Cooper had something like Dodge's fire burning in his favorite of his own novels, The Prairie, first published in 1827. Cooper's Eastern readers are held in suspense throughout most of chapter 13 by the approach of a great prairie fire from which the old trapper rescues his party at the last moment by lighting a fire in advance of the main one and having it ready for human occupancy by the time the sheet of flames arrives. He stepped his party into the burned-off grass and moved them from side to side as the main fire struck. Cooper's readers clearly were not expected to know of this device, or there would be no justification for the prolonged suspense which the chapter is supposed to create. But the escape fire on the prairie is no literary invention. Mavis Lockscheider of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Missouri, an outstanding authority on the life of the Plains Indians, sent me evidence showing that something like this kind of fire was traditionally set by Plains Indians to escape from grass fires, and that pioneers on the plains picked up the invention from the Indians. In his second volume of The American Fur Trade of the Far West, Hiram Chittenden describes how the prairie escape fire worked in the early 1800s. Quote, the usual method of avoiding the danger of these prairie fires was to start one in the immediate vicinity of the person or company in peril. This fire, at first small and harmless, would soon burn over an area large enough to form a safe asylum, and when the sweeping cohorts of flame came bearing down upon the apparently doomed company, the mighty line would part as if by prearrangement and pass harmlessly by on either side. There are still good grounds, however, to believe Dodge invented his escape fire. Why doubt his word before the Board of Review that he had never heard of such a thing before? Even if it was known to mountain men, it could not have been much used in temperate country, if for no other reason than it would seldom work there. The heat of a timber fire is too intense, and the fire is too slow and prolonged and consumes too much oxygen to permit walking around in it. Chances are Dodge's fire wouldn't even have been thought of if Dodge had been caught on the other timber side of Man Gulch, where the fire started. Moreover, Dodge's escape fire differs in important ways from the escape fires used by Indians and pioneers. Dodge's fire was started so close to the main fire that it had no chance to burn a large asylum in which the refugee could duck and dodge the main fire. Not being able to duck and dodge and remain alive, Dodge lay down in the ashes where the heat was least intense and where he was close enough to the ground to find some oxygen. Of course, Dodge had a smoke jumper's knowledge that if you can't reach the top of the hill, you should turn and try to work back through the burned out areas in the front of a fire. But with the flames of the fire front solid and 100 yards deep, he had to invent the notion that he could burn a hole in the fire. Perhaps, though, His biggest invention was not to burn a hole in the fire, but to lie down in it. Perhaps all he could patent about his invention was the courage to lie down in his fire. Like a lot of inventions, it could be crazy and consume the inventor. His invention, taking as much guts as logic, suffered the immediate fate of many other inventions. It was thought to be crazy by those who first saw it. Somebody said to hell with that, and they kept going, most of them to their deaths. Dodge later told Earl Cooley that when the fire went over him, he was lifted off the ground 2 or 3 times. This lasted approximately 5 minutes, he concludes in his testimony, and you and I are left to guess what this was like. His watch said 6:10 when he sat up. By that time, death had come to Man Gulch. Dodge himself was allowed to live a little over 5 years more, and then was thought to be about the maximum time one who had Hodgkin's disease could live. However, he would never jump again. His wife knew when he entered the hospital for the last time that he knew it was for the last time. Like many woodsmen, he always carried a jackknife with him in his pants pocket, always. She told me that when he entered the hospital for the last time, he left his jackknife home on his bedroom table. So he and she knew. When Rumsey and Salih reached the crevice, the main fire had reached the bottom of Dodge's escape fire. They were ahead of the flames, or at least thought they were, but couldn't be sure because of the rolling and unrevealing smoke. Rumsey fell into what he thought was a juniper bush and would not have bothered to get up if Salih hadn't stopped and coldly looked at him. In the summer of 1978, when Rumsey and I were there, he thought the juniper bush must have been, he said to me, he thought the juniper bush must have been, he said to me, I guess I would be dead if he hadn't stopped. Funny thing though, he never said a word to me. He just stood there until I said it to myself. But I don't think he said anything. He made me say it. They ran up gulch on the top of the ridge for 100 yards or so and staggered down the slope on the other side of the ridge. There they stumbled into a rock slide, several hundred feet long and perhaps 75 feet wide. The dimensions hardly seemed large enough, but there weren't any other rock slides around. Within 5 minutes, the fire coming down from the top of the ridge had reached them. Although Rumsey says they were both half hysterical, they were objective enough to see that the fire, as it approached them, was following the pattern of the fire coming over a ridge and starting down the other side. At the top of the ridge, it burned slowly, veering back and forth in the way fires do as winds from opposite sides of a ridge meet each other. It flapped, sometimes it turned downhill toward them, and once it turned sideways and jumped a draw with a spot fire, and, well, started there, it jumped back again. Once below the fluctuations at the top of the ridge, it settled down and burned straight toward them. It burned with such intensity that it created an updraft, sucking in its center so that it was now a front with 2 pincers. It hit the rock slide on 2 sides. Rumsey and Salih, like the early prairie pioneers, tried to duck and dodge in their asylum, but there wasn't much room for running. Rumsey said the fuel was thinner near the top of the ridge. The flames were only 8 to 10 feet high. A form like a solidification of smoke stumbled out of the smoke ahead and died in the rocks. It was a 4-point buck, burned, hairless except for the eyelashes. After the fire passed the rock slide, it really started rolling downhill, replacing trees with torches. Soon they heard someone calling from far off, but it turned out to be only 30 yards away. It was Bill Hellman. His shoes and pants were burned off, and his flesh hung in patches. When asked at the review, did Hellman at that time seem to be suffering tremendously, Salih answered yes. To the question, did he make any statement to you, Salih's reply was, he just said to tell his wife something, but I can't remember what it was. They laid him on a long, flat rock to keep his burns out of the ashes. As Rumsey says, there wasn't much else we could do, having thrown away all their first aid supplies on their flight from the fire. Suddenly there was a shout and a form in the smoke. It was Dodge, answering the shouting that had gone on between them and Hellman. He didn't appear excited, but he looked kind of, well, you might say, dumbfounded or shocked. His eyes were red from smoke and his clothes black with ashes. He obviously was not his fastidious self, but he still had a characteristic about him. They didn't say much about anything, least of all about whether the missing were alive. Dodge, in coming over the hill, had seen one alive and couldn't remember his name except that it began with S, Joe Silva. Then when Dodge sat up on his own fire, he heard someone holler faintly to the east, and after a long time found him only 150 to 200 feet up gulch and oddly below him, perhaps 100 feet. He was badly burned, euphorically happy. Dodge moved him to the shelter of the big rock and cut the shoes off his swollen feet, but there was no use in Dodge leaving his only worldly gift with him, his can of Irish potatoes, since Silva could not feed himself with the charred and useless remains of his hands. In the hours to come, he would be without water because he could not lift his canteen. Evidently, Dodge hadn't seen any others as he came up the hill or across to the other side, and as he said at the review, by the time he reached Rumsey, Salih, and Hellman, he didn't think of any of the others were still alive. Rumsey and Salih had come to a more hopeful conclusion once the fire passed them by on the rock slide. After all, they had made it, and besides, once they understood the intention of Dodge's fire, they believed it would work and assumed at least some of the crew behind them had understood Dodge's fire and crowded into it. But Dodge's arrival eliminated that possibility, so there was very little they dared talk about. After a while, Dodge and Salih left Hellman in Rumsey's care and started back uphill through the ashes without saying just why. Since none had been saved with Dodge, the assumption now was that any survivors would have made it over the hill, as Rumsey and Salih had, so their search was a short one. Besides, the heat was still so intense it soon drove them back. They didn't have to explain why they didn't have anything to say when they returned. It was getting dark. Hellman already had drunk most of their water, even though it made him sick. He could see the glare of the Missouri a mile and a half below, and it inflamed his thirst, but he was not allowed to think of walking. He did revive enough to become talkative. It was here that he told Rumsey that he had been burned at the top of the ridge, and it was partly on the basis of this remark that Salih formed his assumption that Hellman had worked the top of the ridge by following the down gulch side of Dodge's fire, and so had no buffer between him and the main fire raging up gulch. Once burned, though, like a wounded deer, he had started downhill for water but had collapsed after a few hundred yards. He was told to lie still on the rock and keep talking to forget the pain. Rumsey stayed with him, and at dusk Dodge and Salih started for the river, Dodge leaving with him his canteen of water and his can of Irish white potatoes. Dodge and Salih had enough time getting down to the river. They had a tough time getting down to the river. They had to go half a mile or more before they could find a weak spot in the fire front through which to work their way. They had no map or compass, and when they reached the river, they went the wrong way.